Soy María Quintas, educadora del Departamento de Educación del Museo. Voy a presentar al segundo de nuestros ponentes, David Anderson, que como por su nombre podéis sacar, va a hacer la ponencia en inglés, por si a alguien le falta tener el aparato de traducción simultánea. ¿Todos lo tenéis? ¿Nadie tiene que salir? Perfecto. David Anderson es el director general del Museo Nacional de Gales, que yo me he apuntado aquí, como se dice en gaélico, lo voy a intentar, David, tú me dirás si lo digo bien o mal, Amgueddfa Cymru. Os voy a contar un poco acerca de su biografía. Él nació en Belfast, Irlanda del Norte, pero se cría en Inglaterra. Y posteriormente estudió en la Universidad de Edimburgo historia irlandesa. Y actualmente trabaja en Gales, como os había dicho. Se inicia como profesor de historia y posteriormente empieza a trabajar en el ámbito de la educación y museos, trabajando en diversas instituciones, tales como Royal Pavilion and Museums en Brighton, National Maritime Museum en Greenwich y posteriormente en la V&A, donde fue director de aprendizaje e interpretación, hasta 2010. En 2010 es cuando se traslada al Museo Nacional de Gales. Ha escrito numerosos artículos sobre política y museos. Y a lo largo de su trayectoria profesional ha intentado crear e implementar proyectos que pongan en diálogo, en comunicación, sociedad, comunidad y museos. Es decir, ha intentado satisfacer a través de los museos las demandas y necesidades sociales. Y aquí el kit de la cuestión y el por qué nos interesa tanto la trayectoria profesional de David es porque en sus numerosos escritos ha puesto de manifiesto que el hecho de haber trabajado en diversos espacios de alguna forma le ha obligado a investigar cómo los programas educativos impactan directamente en el público y a partir de ahí generar los cambios. Bueno, sin más dilación, os dejo con David Anderson y su ponencia. ¿Hay luz en nuestro camino? Gracias, David.
Gracias. I apologize for speaking English. I will talk probably more than I should do about dreams and angels. But first I want to just talk a little bit about the context of where we are. The profound economic and social changes that we have experienced across Europe, worldwide, and the background, maybe some of the causes which we still scarcely understand, perhaps for all the populist protest and on occasion left-wing reorganization that we're seeing in Europe too, but a context where household income has fallen or stagnated for, in Italy, 85% of the population, or the UK, 70% of the population, but in Sweden, only by 20%, for 20% of the population. And the neoliberalism, which is everywhere and yet nowhere, that has no care for the past or really for the future, no care for individuals or communities, no care for place, and manifests itself through brands and businesses and then disappears again from the towns or cities or villages in which it appeared, without restriction and without obligation, and within a legal framework globally that is largely beyond democratic control. So we've had a decade of austerity, but in this economic model, the one we've made for ourselves over recent decades, no austerity will ever be enough. In this context, Brexit and Trump are not the cause of the problem, but they're symptoms of it, of a distrust of liberal elites, and that includes a distrust of arts elites as well. Last year, there was a public survey for which elements of government expenditure had most public support and which had least. Arts funding was the second least popular area for public funding support. So for all our talk of working with communities and being at the service of the public, the perception from the other end of the telescope is very different. We are parts of the breakdown of the relationship between the contract between the citizen and society. We're not separate from it, we're part of it. And we have some responsibility. And it's in that context that I feel we should be talking about what we in museums should do. In asking what lights might guide us, I think each of us can probably look and identify one, maybe more, individuals from previous generations who have inspired us. And for me, such an individual is Elizabeth Esteve-Cole, who was director at the V&A from 1988 to 1996. She abandoned her degree to marry a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, and told me many years later that she had been inspired throughout her life by being with people who'd given up everything for what they believed in. And that was the flame, the spirit that took her into museums, as well as libraries, where she started, and made her so passionate about educational work, community work, and the role of museums in the service of society. And she gave me the space to work in that way. I've got three themes: the social and economic challenges that I've talked a bit about as well, and I think we can look to the past sometimes for examples, that museums are most effective when they're rooted in their societies, and that we need to develop creative approaches to cultural participation. I'll start as well with the Museums Association in the UK's policy document, about 3 years old now, Museums Change Lives, which is its vision for the impact of museums on society, with itself three themes: that museums can enhance well-being, can create better places, and can inspire people and ideas. I was president of the UK Museums Association when this was written, and I now look back 3 years later and think that this was not radical enough. It was contested at the time, and some of the major museum organisations in the UK tried to water down even what's in that document, and we resisted as best we could. But I still think that it's not yet radical enough. But it does say that most museums, every museum ideally, can do more to maximise its social impact. At the conference 2 years ago, which helped to launch the resource, the policy, the whole conference was dominated by the theme of changing lives, and included this presentation by an actor, performer, who had been a thalidomide baby, who really critically looked at the way in which museums have interpreted their objects which relate to disability, and connected our museum practice with the prejudices in society over decades and even centuries, and demonstrated very clearly to us that those prejudices still are deeply embedded in the way in which we catalogue objects and present them to the public. And it was a useful and harsh criticism of our work in just one area among potentially many. Alongside Museums Change Lives, there's been the publication of a new code of ethics. This too, in my view, is not radical enough. It's important, and it's a shift from where we were before, but I don't feel that it fully addresses the ethical issues of arts organisations in contemporary British society. This may seem like a deviation from the theme. This is the proclamation of the Irish Republic in 1916. This is the centenary of the rebellion. And this was really the kind of crystallization of a movement that had at its center many idealistic visions, but also a concept of blood sacrifice and legitimizing violence to achieve its goal. Some of the ideals: in the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland through us summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom. Well, who are we? And who defines nationhood? And where does God come into it? Some of the fine ideals: guarantees religious and civil liberty, equal rights, and equal opportunities for all citizens. And it was clear that that was for women as well as men. Cherishing all the children of the nation equally, and oblivious to differences, fostered by an alien government, that's the English, which have divided a minority in the past. And here are the leaders, one of whom was a close relative of a senior member of staff at the National Museum of Ireland, who lost his job as a result of his support for the rebellion, but if I'm correct, later on went on to become director of the National Museum of Ireland after the independent Irish government was established. But Yeats wrote so soon after the event, "Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? Was it needless death after all?" And then he goes on to talk about the dream of the rebels. "We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. What if an excess of love bewildered them till they died?" And indeed, the promises to the women of Ireland were betrayed. In many respects, women have not had the same rights as men in the new republic. What emerged was a very socially conservative society, which referred to its past in ways that were romantic as well as nationalist. For example, the blind musician O'Carolan, on the banknote, promulgating an idea of a nation of poets and musicians. And then 100 years on, the reality. And this is an Irish writer quoting Yeats's poem, "There's an angel in the sky. Not long ago, one of the young drug addicts who hangs around on the River Liffey boardwalks near the O'Connell Bridge told me that he'd seen an angel above the river and that she spoke to him, but he could not make out her words. His eyes were very far away and he'd not many teeth, and he was chewing on pills that he popped from a card." Another likely shelter for drug addicts is beneath the portico of the GPO, General Post Office, 150 yards away, where the proclamation of a republic was beautifully declaimed. And some days it's nice to dream that it's possible that we might yet get to live in one, where in fact we're all cherished equally, that we might be housed and treated, and not left to the streets, where the only salvation for body and soul lies in a deep narcotic psychosis, where the city thrums its 1,000 colours, and there's an angel in the sky above the river. The President of the Irish Republic, at the same period like this year, said, My view is that while long shadow cast by what has been called the Troubles in Northern Ireland has led to a scrutiny of the Irish Republican tradition of physical violence, a similar review of supremacist and militarist imperialism in Britain remains to be fully achieved. And I think he's being very polite there. It's hardly started. And I think we look with shame in Britain this year that not a single museum has done any significant exhibition about the centenary of the Rising in 1916, or even really about the relationship between Britain and Ireland. This is an historical void, an area which is really not talked about properly. And unlike in North and South of Ireland, where a very painful process of discussion has been going on, in Britain that discussion is still largely closed. So where are we as museums in that? We've done some small things at the National Museum of Wales, but we didn't do enough, and we're responsible. And I think this quote from Bertolt Brecht is salient: "Unhappy the land that is in need of heroes." Sherwood Anderson, no relation, just under a century ago, wrote again about a dream, about a writer who had a dream. "In the beginning, when the world was young, there were a great many thoughts, but no such thing as truth. Man made the truths himself, and each truth was a composite of a great many vague thoughts. All about in the world were truths, and they were all beautiful. And then the people came along. Each as he appeared snatched up one of the truths, and some who were quite strong snatched up a dozen of them. It was the truths that made people grotesque. The old man had quite an elaborate theory concerning the matter. It was his notion that the moment one of the people took one of the truths to himself, called it his truth, and tried to live his life by it, he became a grotesque, and the truth he embraced became a falsehood. I sometimes wonder whether we, as museums, and particularly within the Anglo-European tradition of traditional museology, have taken a truth about the power of culture and made it grotesque, and ourselves are now living, in a sense, in a falsehood. Irvine Walsh, a great Scottish writer, a couple of years ago, at the time of the Scottish referendum for independence from England, Britain, wrote the following: "The Yes movement, that was yes to leave, which didn't win, of course, hit such heights because the UK state was seen as failed, antiquated, hierarchical, centralist, discriminatory, out of touch, and acting against the people." And he said that the Scots have shown the world that the corporate-led neoliberal model, which is based on bloated military budgets, has limited appeal. I just quote this really because I want to argue that there are alternatives to the populist right, and occasionally they do get democratic support as well, and that we can ourselves no longer regard us as being apolitical, non-political. It's not to argue that we should support particular parties or particular specific ideologies, but there are a certain set of values which have political manifestations to do with human rights, to do with equality, to do with the right to cultural participation, which should be the foundations upon which we build our work. And so much of what's being done by many museums in Britain does not match that opportunity and that possibility. And in my view, is one of the reasons why, when it comes to support for public funding for museums, it's weak and even antagonistic. To even darken the mood still further, this is not the first time in history that people have felt that the tide is moving in a negative way. Cassius Dio, our history now descends from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. But everything changes. William Morris, wallpaper designer extraordinaire, but actually political activist as well. And in his later years, he became a revolutionary socialist too, and a communist, in a different strand from Marxist communism. And his most recent and best biographer said that what drove him into revolutionary activism was his anger and shame at the injustices within society. His novel, News from Nowhere, which maybe not many will have come across, is a utopian novel published in 1890, I remember rightly. And in it, he describes the future utopian society. In this work, art is in the detail of household goods, in the conservation of the countryside, thoughtful planning of towns, proper upkeep of roads. In other words, the civic, the public, the shared. And in this novel as well, the museums have largely disappeared. The South Kensington Museum, which is now the Science Museum in the V&A, has disappeared entirely to be replaced by woods and streams where children play. The National Gallery has survived, but the traveller in this utopia says there are lots more national galleries all across the country, much better than the one in London. Fundamental to Morris's ideas were the education of desire, the stimulation of a wish to enhance the quality of our lives. It's culture and action, the uses of culture for learning, creativity and pleasure that define the quality of a museum and quality of a society. And it's clear from the News from Nowhere novel how disillusioned Morris had become with the museums that he himself had helped to create. Andrew Carnegie, in 1904, again, models from the past, presented the city of Dunfermline with the huge sum of £500,000 in those days, huge amount of money, many tens of millions of pounds today in value, with one brief: to bring to the lives of the toiling masses of Dunfermline, which was where he'd been born before he was so successful in America, some charm, some happiness, some elevating conditions of life which residents elsewhere would have denied. The citizens of Dunfermline found two people to prepare plans for how Carnegie's vision could be achieved. One of them was Patrick Geddes, biologist, social reformer, city planner, radical activist, many, many things. And in many ways, the work that he wrote, the report that he wrote, City Development, which he published in 1904, was the synthesis of all his ideas about what a good society should be. But first, he took a photographer with him, and he photographed virtually every square metre of the city. This is a before and after. He first took the photograph to show how appalling the sewage systems were, the drainage of sewage straight into a river running through the city, and then went back a few weeks later after a storm to show that even those pipes had been swept away by the water. And again, for him, like Morris, art is in the detail of our daily lives, in the care we take for our environment. A photograph of another part of the city at the time, which he then embellished and worked to turn into the city as it could become. And this is his panoramic overview of the city after all the changes that he wanted to recommend had been made. So, in some ways, nothing very extraordinary about that idea of transforming a city, really, and many cities have been transformed, particularly after earthquakes or fires or whatever. But what was different about Geddes was that he took a particular museum spirit, and his transformation of the city was to take that museum thinking and use it in every building and every square metre of the place. It did include museums. An open-air geological museum, a Japanese tea house, a zoological museum, and an open-air social history museum. But one of the big differences was that he wasn't going to spend all the money at one go to achieve this. He was going to use just the interest on the capital and have the citizens, the school children, the students, the young people, the older people, actually do the rebuilding for themselves. So this was to be a community rebuilding of a city with relatively small amounts of money each year to achieve it. And he said, "I have no faith in the educational value of the Commonplace Art Museum with its metal masterpieces in a glass case, and the smithy nowhere." Wherever real technical education is beginning, it centres on seeing and sharing the real work, and then applies the paper drawings and the collections of the old systems to their right uses. Well, we've had a whole century of metal masterpieces in a glass gallery, glass case, and the smithy nowhere. That's been our model for a museum, the opposite of what Geddes was proposing. And what he said he wanted was not utopia, but just e-utopia, just good place. That's all. And this is Wales, in case anybody wants to ask. It's the bit on the left-hand side of Britain, as you look at it. And what you see there are the locations of the 7 museums that make Amgueddfa Cymru, National Museum Wales. 4 of them are industrial museums. 1 is the Roman Legion Museum. 1 is an open-air social history museum. And 1 is a combined art and natural sciences museum. And it's looking at St Fagans that I want to turn to next, because it too started off with a utopian vision in 1948. This is its founder. As a picture of the past and a mirror of the present, St Fagans will be an inspiration for our country's future, and from it will radiate energy to vitalise Welsh life. Now, I should say that even today, perhaps 25–30% of the population speak Welsh reasonably fluently. And most of those are first language Welsh speakers. The English invaded in the 13th century, and there have been many efforts since then to repress both Welsh language and Welsh culture. And the fact that, say, a quarter of the population still hold Welsh language as their dominant language is in itself remarkable. And St Fagans is one of 3 museums of the 7 that is predominantly Welsh language speaking as well. And for many Welsh people generally, but particularly Welsh speakers, it is the focus for identity as a nation. One of the things it does is to take buildings that are derelict or under threat of demolition and to rescue them and bring them to the site as representative of the traditional culture. And this is the whole site. It's a large extent of land with some space still for further development. The whole museum is built on the principle that it's people, not objects, that are carriers of culture. And culture is a living process. And also, as a whole organisation, this is not just St Fagans, we have a new vision which we've given ourselves, which is, I'm losing myself entirely here in my own slides, inspiring people and changing lives. And part of this is to move to the right slide, somehow, from, if you like, a passive role for museums, not just to an active one, but to a participatory. And there is a big difference between those 2 characteristics. And also that we are becoming, sorry, I really am not doing this well, we are becoming a community of volunteers as well as a community of staff. And at the core of this is the idea that humans are naturally creative, and it's this creativity that's enabled the peoples of Wales to survive in all sorts of different ways. Now, so far, so idealistic. Reality. In 1948, when the museum was founded, the Welsh language was perceived to be under great threat of disappearing. The rural way of life, which so many people in Wales had subsisted by, had been overtaken increasingly by industrialisation, coal industry, slate industry, woolen industry, steel industry. And the founder, Iorwerth Pete, whose photograph I showed you, believed that a new museum had to be created in order that those traditional values should be protected. The trouble was, that it was also an exclusionary museum. And for several decades, nothing that related to industry or the lives of the industrial workers was to be found in this vision of Wales. And as a result, large parts of the population did not regard St Fagans as being their museum of social history. It also contained nothing to do with those migrants from all over the world who had come into Wales over many decades before the 1940s, and certainly afterwards. They too were not visible in any way in this nationalist vision of Wales, and this traditionalist vision as well. So, one of the key factors that's being brought into the museum now, and it's being redeveloped in a large capital project, but I hope more importantly as a large social project, is that we have to have a critical understanding of history if we're to participate in contemporary society and make informed decisions. So it is a radical rethink of Iorwerth Peat's own vision, because what he held up was not a true mirror, but to some extent a distorting mirror, for understandable political reasons. But Wales has changed so much between 1948 and 2016. The industries have largely gone. The wealth that the nation had has largely disappeared. Wales is now has some of the poorest communities in the whole of Europe, not just in the United Kingdom, with 70–80% unemployment. Now, I know I'm speaking in a country that's suffering terribly from unemployment as well. There are some parts of the United Kingdom that share that experience, and Wales certainly is one. And also the idea that there are still comforting myths about the past, about Wales's own identity as a nation. This archaeological site up in North Wales was excavated 20–25 years ago, and in a ditch were found 5 human remains, 2 males, an adult female, and 2 teenage children, 1 male, 1 female. And the initial interpretation that was put onto that was that these were local Welsh inhabitants. This is the 10th century AD, so 1,000 years ago. These are local Welsh inhabitants who had been murdered perhaps by Vikings who were invading the coastal areas of Wales, particularly around that time. Not entirely based on evidence, that interpretation. The evidence now from analysis of teeth is that actually the males either came from Scandinavia or from the north of Scotland, and the adult female came from the northwest of England, so not Wales, if you like to call that area of land at that time Wales. So these were actually probably more likely Viking or Viking-related individuals who were murdered by the local citizens instead. And indeed, the fact that the 2 males had had their hands tied behind their backs apparently would suggest that this was violent death as well. So there is a great risk that museums almost unconsciously carry mythologies into their interpretations. And it's so important now, as we examine the relationship between outsiders and indigenous populations almost everywhere, that we don't allow our museum interpretations to be modified by those myths. On the contrary, the job we have is to challenge them. So what we will be doing at the new St Fagans displays, as part of the new capital development, is actually to provide evidence and invite the visitors themselves to bring their own critical understanding and analysis of the evidence and come to their own conclusions. And as we get more evidence from analysis of the site and of the human remains, we will put that evidence into the public domain for that process to continue. There will also be, and there is already, it's now built, a new building in the woods there called Amgueddfa, which is Welsh for workshop. And this is intended to be a world of making, which one walks into. And it's also intended to be a building which invites you to make when you're there and not just to look. And beneath this is the idea that as humans, we have to live by the head, of course, but also by the heart and by the hand. And different parts of the site will give most emphasis to one of those three dimensions. And this one is really focusing on the making and the hand. And it argues that we cannot be truly human if we don't engage all those three dimensions. And we can't therefore be truly human unless we make. And again, one of the consequences of the new global economy is that making has been drained away from so many communities, at least making for employment purposes has been drained away so much. We want to make an argument for making as being something that still should be fought for, should be cherished, should be valued, and to have a space in our museum where we say that very, very loudly and positively, that even if our economic opportunity has been taken from us, that doesn't mean our making should be taken from us. And so there is a, if you like, a political point in this as well. And so it's a celebration of makers of artifacts over thousands of years, which will use the historical collections, but it's also about sharing skills and having a contact between professional makers and amateurs, and also bringing in amateur guilds and societies to work with the public as well. We want making to be normal, not odd. And, sorry, can I go back one? There is another deeper thing here as well. I would argue that human rights should be an absolute foundation of the work that we do. And one area that's little discussed is that of cultural rights. They are there. They're one of the 5 central pillars of the UNESCO United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. But we rarely talk about it. Why is it that cultural institutions so rarely talk about cultural rights? There is a huge disconnect there, and almost a denial. And we have to then ask, why are we in denial about something that should be central to our purpose? I believe in part it is that the Anglo-European model of museums isn't really founded on the idea of cultural rights. It's founded on the idea of professional expertise, which is a different thing. And in so many of our museums, what we do is to say to people, you do not have the right to participate. You have the right to enter, you have the right to observe and to talk, but you don't have the right to participate. And then we wonder why the great majority of the population don't wish to fund us when it comes to surveys. Because those cultural rights are really, really important. There are perhaps 3, maybe more that I've not defined, one of which is the right of indigenous peoples to retain their culture. And you could argue that's what a lot of people in Wales over 700 years have been engaged in doing. So expression of that cultural right is a cultural right. There is also the rights of individual artists to freedom of expression. That's the one which, in Britain anyway, leading museums like the Tate tend to emphasize a lot, particularly if they're artists from far away in a very different culture. Ai Weiwei, for example. Huge shouting from the Tate about Ai Weiwei's rights to express his artistic vision. And, you know, we would all support that. It's what's deafening is the Tate's silence on other kinds of cultural rights, and in particular the third one, which is the right to participate as an individual and as a community in cultural life. That very, very foundational cultural right, properly participate. And why do we not declare that? Maybe because if we did do so, we would have to change fundamentally the way in which museums actually operate in their work with the public. And that's not welcome for lots of people working in museums. And I've actually heard people say, I didn't come into museums to do this sort of work at all. And it's probably true, they probably didn't. However, this sort of work is exactly what is our core responsibility and is what we should be doing. At St Fagans, my curatorial colleagues and education colleagues have worked together with over 200 street-level charities, working with drug addicts, working with homeless people, as well as community organisations from all over Wales, on every aspect of the development of the new site, whether it's which objects will be chosen, which stories will be told, who the displays are intended for, how we should be making it possible for people to participate. Even the selection of staff, volunteers are being from charities and communities are being involved in helping to write job descriptions and sitting on panels to select staff as well. In other words, coming quite deep into the work of the museum, and we want to do it deeper still. Those are the kind of things which we're still doing inadequately and in not doing enough of it at all. I don't want to claim we're wonderful in this, but we are on a journey. These are the kind of things that participation in the cultural life of the community should be meaning. But who talks about it? And why not? Part of the St Fagans development, as well as the new buildings, is the reconstruction of archaeological sites which have been excavated in Wales. This is the Great Hall from one of the sort of palaces built by the last princes of Gwynedd, who came closest to being kings of Wales. This is about 1280 AD, and we're reconstructing it, but again, we're using volunteers to do a lot of the work alongside professional staff to build it. And this, again, is a vital part of the construction of the whole museum. Csikszentmihalyi, in The Art of Seeing, said that it's vital that we develop skills of encoding human experience in works of art, which I would also, so works of beauty, which I would also call making, and the skills of decoding it if they were lost. If we don't have those skills, we're condemned to live within the limits of our own present, really. And I would argue it's part of the purpose of a museum to help people to develop, to enable people to develop those skills. But practice is an essential part of that. And I do also think there is an ethical responsibility to those who've lived in the past and whose voices are not heard. Maybe the concept of the justice of history is a contentious one, and I would acknowledge that. But nevertheless, I do feel that there is something about recovering lost voices and giving space for alternative views of the past as well. And equally, before us are all those millions who are yet to be born. And we do have a responsibility to ensure that the legacy we pass on is one which allows opportunities for thought and action, and inspiration as well. This is a project which the St Fagans Museum did a few years ago. It was called Refugee House, and the museum had been working for 5 or 6 years already at that stage with refugee and asylum seeker communities in South Wales. And the community representatives themselves came up with the idea that the museum would display a real kitchen, a real bedroom, and a real living room from one of the families that they represented. And so far as was possible, we, with them, recreated those 3 living spaces. And what they also, the refugees and asylum seekers, wanted was that they themselves should be the interpreters in the spaces. So for the duration of the exhibition, they were the people who stood in the galleries, and they were the ones who talked to visitors. And you see down on the bottom right there was opportunities also, and bottom left as well, for people to put photographs, but also to put comments on as well. And there were some negative comments about refugees and asylum seekers, but what was interesting was how many people then put contrary views next to them, saying, we're glad you've come, you're contributing to our society, we want you to stay. But I think it was immensely brave of those refugees and asylum seekers to put themselves into the public domain and be there to have that debate with the public about why they'd come to Wales, what they had to offer, and, if you like, the future that they wanted to contribute to society. Inspired partly by that, National Theatre Wales then did a piece of immersive theatre for the public called Border Game. And if you took part in this, then you were invited to take a false identity, to travel across the border from Wales into England before the start of the experience. You would then have to adopt your new identity because you were going to try and smuggle yourself or be smuggled back into Wales as if you were a refugee or asylum seeker. And you needed a false identity in order to get through the border controls. This was set in a near future where Wales has become an independent country, and because of the spread of animal diseases and others around England, many people are trying to escape from England into Wales, which by this time has become economically much more successful than England as well. We are talking about near future, not the present. And so many people were from England and elsewhere were trying to escape to Wales and security and better health. In the process of that, and I took part in this as just one of the so-called refugees, you were put in the hands of the people smugglers. And they didn't treat you well. And they also told you that you could not trust many of the people who were around you. We got on a train in Bristol. With our false identity, we then travelled across the border and with checks along the way, and tried to be consistent in our stories. When we got to Newport, the first railway station in Wales, we were all taken off the train and our documents were checked. Some people got through, some didn't. I didn't get through. I was taken down to a basement where there was a prison, and I was interrogated by the border police. There was a camera near my head filming me, and online people could see my interrogation. Because online were people like May, who's a proud active citizen. This is a group of citizens who've signed up to help the police to decide whose story should be believed and who should stay in and who should not. So each of us who was interrogated, our futures were decided not just by the police, but also by these active citizens. And I thought that National Theatre Wales's production was incredibly important because it showed us that cultural participation isn't necessarily always a positive. Sometimes, in the wrong hands, it could be used as a tool of repression as well. There is a threat implicit in that poster. This is on Newport Station. They'd really set the station, if you like, as part of the theatrical experience. There is a threat there. It's not just participation, it's also control, and it's also excluding the people you don't want to have come in. And at the end of it all, we went for a meal, just hot soup and a cup of tea. This is winter, depths of winter. And we met then the people who had been the people smugglers, the actors in that. And it turned out that they were all refugees and asylum seekers. What they had been doing for us was living out their own experiences in trying to get into Britain. There's a quote from Ben Ockery, and he's writing here about the Bennion Bronzes, which are held in the British Museum, and which were taken in a military raid on the then Kingdom of Benin in Africa in the late 19th century, in reprisal for some apparent minor incursion that had been done against the will of the British Crown. And he talks about, in order to talk about the spiritual significance of works of art like Bennion's Bronzes, it's important to appreciate they're the collective manifestation through the artist of the way in which people of that land think and dream and remember and project. When that's lost, removed from the land, the works of art are in permanent exile, which is to say, one half of them dies. The second thing that happens is that the people themselves are in a sort of exile. They're in exile from the repository of their dreams. One of the most effective and tragic ways of destroying a people's spirit is to, as it were, destroy the validity of their works of art. I don't know what the title of this film was in Spanish. I believe in the German, which I also don't speak, I'm ashamed to say. It was The Sky Above Berlin was the title, if I've translated into English. In English, it was Wings of Desire. Now, there's a few scenes quite early on in the film, and I've extracted some of the text from this. There are two angels sitting in a car, and the first one says, "It's great to exist as the spirit, to testify day by day and forever as the spiritual in people's minds. But I do get tired of my spiritual existence, of forever hovering above. I wish I could grow a weight which would bind me to the earth. Say now and now, and no longer forever and eternity. Sit at an empty place at the card table and be greeted even by a nod. Because these angels are invisible to the humans who are all around them. It would be rather nice for once to find excitement not in the mind but in a meal, to feel your bones moving as you walk." But the second angel says, "Be serious. We can do no more than look, assemble, testify, preserve. To remain the spirit, keep your distance." Now, do those words, look, assemble, testify, preserve, have any resonance for us as museum people? We have to remember that each of us, according to Amin Maalouf, has two identities, two heritages, really. A vertical one that comes from our ancestors, arguably, in my case, Irish, our religious community and our popular traditions, and a horizontal one transmitted to us by our contemporaries and by the age in which we live, which makes it complicated for me to describe myself as Irish anymore. It seems to me that the latter is the more influential of the two, and it becomes more so every day. We're becoming beings woven out of multicoloured threads. And also, this piece of writing from a European-funded project. A museum is not only a building with collections, exhibitions, archives and staff. This is just the shell. A museum is something else, something much more important. It's been described as a way of looking and a way of thinking, a place of stories and ideas, a natural and cultural history, a world of objects, memories and the art of living, and a place for debate of all the issues connected with the society we actually live in. And I particularly like in that the phrase, a way of looking and a way of thinking. Because if it's a way of looking and a way of thinking and a place of stories and ideas, it's not just within the walls of a museum that we can do that. Actually, maybe being museum isn't being inside a building at all. Maybe it's a way of thinking and feeling and acting, the head, the heart and the hand. But with a deep trust and understanding of the potential of culture right at its heart. So I want to ask a question. Are museums political? Should they be political? What metaphor should we use for the relationship between a museum and society in these very dark times? I feel in the 21st century we're now entering a forest in many parts of Europe anyway that is getting darker and darker as we go. In this context, what is our relationship to society, but particularly to governments? Are we a faithful servant, doing our master's will? Mirror, as Yorwerth Pete said, reflecting the world back to itself? Or a recording angel, reporting but never acting? Could we aspire to be something more? Could we aspire to social justice and social activism and making a difference to society? In other words, stepping outside the walls of museums to go to other places, and maybe even saying that it's society that's the locus of our work, and the museum is the addition, not that museum is the core of our work and society is the optional addition. So I would argue that learning, education, human rights and cultural participation and social justice are the four legs of the stool on which we should sit, or maybe the four legs that we walk on. I'm not quite sure how the metaphor goes from there. But that those are fundamental to us, and if somebody says that's political, then so be it. So be it. We can no longer afford to stand still. We can no longer afford to ignore what's happening in the society around us. Frankly, I don't think we'll survive if we do ignore it anyway. At least very few museums will. So for most museums, there is no choice anyway. But I think it's deeper than that. I think it's an ethical responsibility. And I think we can look back to the past and see examples of thinkers who have challenged the status quo a century and more ago, but weren't listened to. But maybe now is the time for us to start to listen to them. After all, we are places of the past as well as the future. Thank you very much.